Now that we're creating this conversation inside of our bot directly from the bot service and through the main VM, the next thing that we have to do is to be able to send requests. So these are going to be called activities. An activity is going to be a message that we send. So let me set this up first by going over here to the main page and replace the content with something different. Right away, I'm going to set a grid, and inside of the grid, I am going to set a couple of columns. The first one is going to have, these are going to be rows. And the first one is going to be using the entire available space, and the second one is going to have a height of auto. Is going to automatically use the necessary height. I will also define a stack layout inside of the grid, which is going to have an orientation of horizontal. And I'm going to start by defining an entry in here. And this stack layout is going to be in the second row. And it's going to have horizontal options of fill and expand, and so is the entry. Let me set some margin to the grid and also create a button right here. This button is going to have a command that I'm going to define over here in the main VM, which is going to be called send command, and which is going to be executing a send activity method that eventually is going to be calling a method that we will create in the bot service. So this is pretty much set up in the main VM. In the button, let's just get the command binding to the send command. So just like this. And of course, we need to establish the binding context. So let me establish it right away from the grid, which is going to have a binding context pointing to the static resource of VM. So let me go ahead and define that method that is going to be sending the activity. This is going to be a public method inside of the bot service helper. And this public method is going to be the send activity method. And is the one that has to be called from the send activity method over in the main VM. So we already have the bot helper instance. All we have to do is call the send activity. Now in here, we're going to need to bind yet something else. And by the way, we don't require this object in here. What we do need is a property, another property, which will be a string that I'm going to be calling message. And the message is the one that is going to be sent to the send activity method. And so of course over here we have to make the send activity method receive a string. Now, what we are going to need to be able to get this message string is to bind it over to this entry. So the text of this entry is going to be binding to the message, which means, because this is going to, by the way, have a mode of two-way, that we need to implement the iNotify property changed interface so we know when this message changes. So in fact, let me go ahead and define the message like this. So it's calling an onProperty changed method. So I need to create that method after I implement the iNotify property changed interface. So I have this property changed event handler. And so I have this onProperty changed method. So we have this ready. So we know whenever the message property changes, we are going to update the value by calling that onProperty changed method. So that means that the send activity is already going to have everything that it needs. So we're going to need to make a request very similar to the one that we just did when creating the conversation. The only thing is that, of course, we need to change a few things. First, well, this also has to be an async method. But first, the conversation is actually going to get the conversation ID that we should already have here in the conversation property. So right after the conversation, I am going to add / and access the conversation ID. So this is going to be the new endpoint. The base address is going to be the same. We're still going to be requiring the authorization. And I'm missing something in the endpoint. After getting the conversation ID, we have to access the activities endpoint. And this time we are going to need to send some content to the post async method. So previously for this other endpoint we didn't need anything, that's why the content is null, but this time we will need some content. So I will create that content by serializing an object into JSON, and then the JSON, getting the bytes and sending that content. But first, to be able to create that object, I'm going to need the type. So I'm going to create a new public class activity. And I'm actually also going to need a public class. This has to be, let's call this channel account, which is basically just going to have a couple of properties that are going to be strings. One of them is going to be the ID, and the other one is going to be the name. This is going to be the person who is sending the request. So actually, let me go ahead and create a property in activity that is going to be of type channel account that is going to be called from. And in activity, we're also going to need a property that is going to be string and that is going to be called text, which is simply going to contain that message that we're receiving in the send activity. And finally, it is also going to require yet another string that is going to be the type. Now the type is interesting. We're only going to eventually set the type to message, but this could actually have a type for when a user is deleted, when the user is typing, so the bot could actually respond to those events. Our bot doesn't, but it could. Just a quick note in here. So this is the activity. Now let me go ahead and before, of course, sending the post request in the send activity method, create an activity. The activity is going to have a from of a new channel account, which is going to have an ID. Let's call this user1. We're also going to be sending the text, which is simply going to be equal to message. And the type, which I mentioned, is going to be message in this case. But again, this one is the one that you could set to typing when the user is writing something. End of conversation, delete user data, conversation update, or contact relation update. But again, this is not something that our bot is going to be doing. For now, this activity is going to be more than enough. Now, to be able to send this over to the post async, let's first get this as a JSON. So we call in this case the serialized object instead of the deserialized objects. And once we have this JSON, we can get a buffer. For that, we're going to be using encoding from system.text. This is going to be UTF-8, and we're going to get the bytes from this string. Then we can get the byte content. So let me go ahead and create a new byte array content that is simply going to get the buffer. And optionally, we can set the bytes content headers and its content type. This is going to be application JSON. And so this byte content is the one that needs to be sent over to the post async method. And finally, this is not really going to be of type conversation. So once I have the JSON from the response, all I have to do, let me go ahead and create an object in here. That is going to be a JSON object from newtonsoft.json.link. And I'm going to be parsing it from the JSON string that I'm going to be receiving. And all I need is the ID, which is actually the only thing that is going to be inside of that JSON. And the ID, in fact, let me go ahead and set a breakpoint in here to show you the JSON before getting the ID, and set a breakpoint over here to show you the ID itself already in the string that is simply going to be getting as a string from this object the ID. So the JSON is going to contain an ID object, which is actually going to be a string, and I'm going to be selecting that ID, setting it as a string and assigning it to this ID variable. So let me go ahead and show you that. Let me just run this on my iPhone simulator. Of course, this is going to work exactly the same on Android. With the breakpoints set up, let me go ahead and send a request. We're not yet going to be receiving the message, but I'm going to either way be sending the same 32-bit versus 64-bit Windows version question that we have been using. Send it. And after just a few seconds, we should see the first breakpoint being hit. And as you can see, the JSON contains, I know it appears very tiny here on my screen, but we can see that the JSON contains only an ID of the activity that we just sent. And of course, we are extracting that, and now we have that ID here on that string. So now that we have successfully sent activities to the bot, of course, the bot has already answered, but we are not yet receiving those answers. So in the next lecture, we're going to learn how are we going to be able to start receiving the answers from the bot. So of course, we can add them to our main activity.